It's the week ending Friday the 6th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Keir Starmer apologising to Grenfell families following the release of a damning report into the fire, Russia attacking Ukraine just 40 miles from the Polish border in a fresh wave of military strikes, and Britain's Sarah Storey securing a record-breaking 18th career gold at the Paralympic Games. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Sorcha Bradley and Arion McNicoll, and we welcome back our one-woman stand against boring art, writer and performer Suchandrika Chakrabarti. Sorcha, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
China's big TV giveaway in Africa.
What's your name?
I'm Bramwell.
Bramwell.
Yeah.
Okay.
Zero pressure every day.
Huh?
Zero pressure.
Okay.
You're
Bramwell?
Zero pressure every day. Like zero chills. That's why I'm so cool.
Oh, that's why you're so cool. Zero pressure every day. Okay. So, simama hapa. In frying pan. Sawa.
But you guys stop telling people that's a frying pan.
No, mami, tunaambia ukweli.
It's not a frying pan, Mom.
Kenya's answer to Take Me Out There dating show Hello Mr. Right. You can watch it on Star Times Kenya on Sunday evenings. Sorcha, no lighty, no likey, but what's the story?
Well, so this week, China has invited 50 of Africa's leaders to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit, which is taking place in Beijing. And there, President Xi Jinping has announced a substantial increase in Chinese support for Africa, pledging 51 billion in aid. Now, it's already been investing a lot in Africa, including in its 10,000 Villages project, which was first announced in 2015. And as part of that project, China partnered with a Chinese company already operating in Africa to bring 10,000 villages satellite television. And that project is now nearly complete, with over 9,600 villages all across Africa now connected to satellite television.
Okay, so these are places where, because we've talked before about Starlink, for example, haven't we, in remote places, bringing the internet to people via satellite. But this is places where people wouldn't even, I suppose, have a smartphone. They have old tellies. So this is a way of really connecting up places that had not experienced some of the technology we had 30 years ago yet.
Yeah, exactly. So the villages were sort of chosen not necessarily because they were the poorest villages, but because they were so remote, and most of these villages, if they did have access to television, it was analog TV, which is, often really choppy and unreliable. And so China and Xi Jinping basically presented this as an opportunity for China to help reduce this digital divide between rural and urban areas in Africa.
And it's not just about the hardware, is it, Suchandrika? What's interesting about this giveaway is it's also, as we were hearing there, about the content. China has been backing TV programs for Africa.
Yeah, and this is a huge soft power flex, and it's really interesting how the Chinese have really kind of tried to hide the fact that they are behind all of this and that they have a lot of influence.
Well, they haven't done it that well. I mean, there's a big Chinese logo on the satellites, right?
So apart from that, they used to have a lot of Chinese talent in front of the TV, and now they've really moved to having a lot of local talent. So for instance, many of the young journalists who are fronting their shows are from Africa, but trained in China and paid by Chinese media entities. And in Kenya alone, 500 journalists and local staff are employed by Chinese media agencies. So it's really a case of the people who are fronting it are kind of great, their local talent, their African faces, but behind the scenes it's really China kind of running those programs and running what the content is as well.
I mean, Arion, in that sense, is this any different? I mean, okay, so it has the hardware component, as I said, of the satellite dishes, but in terms of the content, is it any different to the BBC World Service, to France 24, to Al Jazeera, a state-backed enterprise that is about delivering a certain worldview to a big continent like Africa? I mean, we can't really criticise the Chinese for doing that when we have the World Service, can we?
No, I think not. And I think that we know that states tend to do this. They reach out with their media entities to try to impact the way that other countries think. And China's influence on Star Times channels is genuinely evident from the moment you switch it on. It has a focus on Chinese movies and TVs, such as Kung Fu and Sino drama. Some people get into those shows, even getting obsessive about like Chinese soaps and stuff. Others, not so much. But one particularly popular show is the romance series Eternal Love, which has a niche but apparently obsessive following across Africa. And in fact, by August 2018, the series had reached 50 billion views worldwide, becoming, in the process, the most watched television series in the world. That is presumably massively distorted by having huge population watching the show back in China. But actually, in terms of what the real content winner in Africa is, it's actually football. That remains the top attraction for African audiences. The 2023 Africa Cup of Nations, for example, drew in nearly 2 billion viewers across Africa and around the world. So StarTimes has really tried to capitalize on this by investing heavily in football broadcasting rights, including AFCON, as well as La Liga and Bundesliga. It so happens that for them, it's unfortunate that English Premier League matches are still the ones that most African people want to watch. But, going back to China's news offering, they have this international-facing state broadcaster CGTN, which is included in StarTimes' cheapest package, but it's not popular. It just doesn't get viewers like BBC or CNN or
Kung Fu soap operas. I mean, I'm there.
Or Kung Fu soap operas, yeah. Just it doesn't get bums on seats. But StarTimes has been quite attentive to this, and that's why, like Suchandrika was saying, they've been responding by producing more local news shows and employing many more local people to be the talent on those shows, while still being able to project the messages that they want to project. So there is definitely a big soft power imperative that's going on there. They've just got smart delivery systems that are trying to tweak the fact that people are not necessarily falling for it immediately.
But Sorcha, Arion mentioned the cheapest package there, as if this is something you pay for, and indeed it is. But that wasn't made initially clear to all of these African villages that got satellite dishes, was it?
No, so part of the reason why actually this initiative doesn't appear to have been too much of a success is that lots of these villagers were initially given free subscriptions, and then eventually after about 5 or 6 months they discovered they had to pay. And then after they've been enjoying the TV for a few months, they didn't want to pay what they felt were high costs for the subscription. I think the cheapest is about $2 per month, which to us seems relatively inexpensive, but in lots of these places that is a substantial amount to be paying per month for entertainment. Actually, it's not just that people who had digital TV switched on in their villages weren't interested in the content. They wanted more local programs and local news. It's been too expensive. So as sort of a soft power move, it hasn't been sustainable for China, because if no one's watching what you're putting out there because it's too expensive, then they're not having the kind of reach I think they hoped they would have.
Yeah, and weirdly, Suchandrika, I mean, obviously the point is for China is to show how strong they are and how big they are, that they can give away thousands of satellite dishes. But this makes them look less strong, less rich, if they're having given them away, they're then asking people for a subscription.
Yeah, it seems like quite a flawed plan, and not thinking about who your actual audience is. So they're dealing with people who are in isolated villages and who already kind of lived quite happily without this system. So you have to really think about what networks do they already have, what's more interesting in their lives already, and what can we add to it. That's what you do when you launch anything, including a podcast. And it feels like they didn't really do that. They were like, what we offer, because it's international, it will be more interesting than what they have in their isolated village. And it turns out absolutely not, which I love about this. It's just like, no, it's too expensive, and I don't need to know how the Kung Fu drama ends. It's fine. And I really like the sort of the audience has turned around and kind of done that, because China has something called the Belt and Road Initiative, and part of that is they have too much stuff. They manufacture too many things. They're a huge power in the world. And so that was designed for them to offload sort of hardware, like steel, like infrastructure. But also as part of it, they do sort of connect African journalists to other journalists in developing countries. They do train them up. Again, coming back to the fact they're kind of using local talent to put an African face on their propaganda. And it's still just not working. People are like, yeah, that was fine for 6 months, but get rid of it. And it's just such a human response. Like, we'd all do the same if it cost too much. And it doesn't change the fact that they're in isolated villages. They don't really need it.
Yes, but Arion, if you look at that Belt and Road initiative, and we've talked about it before on the show, that is about really big infrastructure projects, isn't it? And as Suchandrika indicated, some of them have been abandoned, some of them haven't worked. But, I mean, some of them are, big train lines that are connecting up parts of countries that previously weren't connected to each other. And that's all about China integrating itself in parts of Africa that had no relationship with China before, so that they can access African raw materials too. How's that going in 2024? What's the big picture on that as we head into the China-Africa summit this week?
Yeah, so last year China celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI as it's often called, and the global reaction remained as divided as you would expect, with Chinese media overwhelmingly praising the project and Western outlets largely demonizing it. The goal of the project was to enhance trade and investment by connecting infrastructure, like these massive infrastructure projects of railways and highways and ports across Asia and Africa and Latin America, with the idea that it could almost replicate ancient Silk Road paths and, through doing so, expand China's political and economic influence. But over the years, China has actually quietly shifted its strategy, basically recognizing the potential global impact in improving infrastructure around the world and how this could be really important in a political way. And in many ways, it has been quite successful, with 150 countries now participating by last year. However, at the same time, the initiative has also led to significant debt, with countries owing over $300 billion to China's Export-Import Bank, because not all of them can pay for the stuff that China is producing for them. And although many projects have been successful, others, like those in Pakistan and Nepal in particular, have faced massive corruption scandals or inefficiency issues. So, recognizing those challenges, China is now focusing on these small, more targeted projects rather than these huge infrastructure-based investments. Things like healthcare and education projects, or small-scale transport things like fixing up local roads. People often care about potholes the world over, and if you can fix their local roads, it may have that same sort of goodwill that is a great part of what this whole thing is all about. And while Western observers do often view this downsizing as a failure, Beijing sees it as a kind of strategic political investment, and despite its financial challenges, the BRI does remain this powerful tool for expanding China's international reach, particularly in the global south. That's where it matters to them, and that's what this is all about.
Yeah, and this is the kind of involvement, Sorcha, across so many different types of industries, as Arion was outlining there, that here in the UK there's now been regulations to prevent, or discussions around, right? Chinese investment in telco, in nuclear power, and all this stuff that was encouraged 10 years ago is now viewed with suspicion. But Africa is still a huge market for Chinese companies.
Yeah, I think it is interesting to observe how China is moving away from these large infrastructure projects, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, which it has garnered a lot of criticism for. Countries have accused China of debt trap diplomacy, and now moving towards more what they call these small and beautiful projects, in which there is a relatively low cost to China, low cost to the countries that these initiatives are being set up in, but theoretically have a high yield, whether that is in terms of, economically or in terms of soft power. And here I think this is an example of a soft power strategy that perhaps hasn't quite come off yet, but it'd be interesting to see out of the summit how they sort of continue down this path and what their sort of soft power strategy in Africa will be next.
Yeah. Okay, up next, Australia's biggest supermodel steps into one Elle of a controversy. Suchandrika, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
We've now got another option for medical advice: WebMD or 90 supermodels.
She did have a lumpectomy. So she has had treatment. Loads of women have lumpectomies for cancer. So I think I'm quite cross about this in that she's coming out. She's got a book. She's making a whole load of money out of saying, look, I've beaten cancer like the alternative complementary therapies. That's really, really dangerous, because anybody the best way to survive cancer is to go to the doctor, to go to the hospital, to have all the treatments. Then they're not easy, they're really difficult, invasive treatments. Quite often, but not all of them.
Yeah.
And then to go out and write a book saying that she'd done it the natural way, it's just not entirely true.
Former editor-in-chief of The Mirror, Alison Phillips, on ITV's This Morning on Wednesday. So, Chandrika, what was the story they were discussing?
They were discussing Elle Macpherson's new memoir in which she relates a cancer diagnosis she got a few years ago and she kept secret. And I think it's really important here to kind of go back to the words that have been reported, because this is a story about misinformation and medical advice. I'm not a doctor and I just want to get this really right. She had an interview about the memoir with Australian Women's Magazine, and in it she was quoted as saying this: she was called by her doctor and informed that the diagnosis of the lumpectomy she'd had was HER2, positive estrogen receptive intraductal carcinoma. Her doctor suggested a mastectomy with radiation, chemotherapy, hormone therapy, plus reconstruction of her breast. So obviously that's very invasive, and you can understand why people wouldn't want to go through all of that, but that is advice from her doctor. She then spent several weeks getting advice from 32 doctors and experts, which is incredible. And then she went to a beach in Miami, prayed and meditated, and made one of the biggest decisions of her life, not to undergo chemo. And then adds that Elle was under the care of several specialists, including a couple of doctors, a doctor of naturopathy, a holistic dentist, osteopath, chiropractor and two therapists. And for treatment, she took herself to Phoenix, Arizona, rented a house for 8 months, where she stayed by herself under a doctor's care. She's quoted as saying, "focusing and devoting every single minute to healing myself." So that is the original story.
Okay, but this all happened a number of years ago. Obviously, you know, I'm glad she's well, but why is this a big story? I realise her book's come out in the last few weeks, but what's the controversy? Why is this your story of the week?
Elle Macpherson was interviewed in an Australian magazine, and that kind of went viral because her comments about kind of being diagnosed with a kind of cancer, a pre-cancer in this case, and not doing anything and healing yourself, that caused uproar in the medical community, amongst cancer survivors and amongst women. Alison Phillips of the ex of The Mirror was obviously speaking there in that clip. And so just a lot of people are kind of questioning her version of events.
And I suppose at its crudest level, Arion, it brings up the discussion, and there are people facing this decision now who have just been diagnosed, about whether in some instances no treatment is better than an extreme treatment like a mastectomy.
Yeah, I think that's why, as Suchandrika's saying, it's been so controversial, this whole business, because on the face of it, it looks like a celebrity refusing proper medical care and trying to get better with kind of mumbo-jumbo treatments of her own devising. But it's worth noting that Macpherson does say that she underwent a lumpectomy, which is a type of surgery that involves removing a breast lump. And The Guardian had a really good corrective article where they spoke to Professor Chris Pike, who's the Director of Medical Services at the Mater Private Hospitals in Brisbane. He said that in itself, a lumpectomy may in some cases be an appropriate standard medical treatment for her particular condition. And Pike, who's a cancer surgeon, says Macpherson's kind of cancer could more accurately be described as a type of non-invasive pre-cancer that has the potential to become aggressive if left untreated. And the problem with the story really has been, according to this kind of Guardian piece that really did a good job of putting all of this into perspective, was that the media reports that first came out, which were based on that initial Women's Weekly exclusive interview with Macpherson about the launch of her new book, they just didn't go into any detail about the size of the pre-cancer or the grade of the cells or other risk factors that she may have had. And it's also unclear whether Macpherson had a diagnosis because she felt a lump or because she underwent some sort of screening, which could tell us about, you know, the point in time, whether it was early or late in this lump's development, and how that could potentially lead to different treatment recommendations, including how important things like radiation or chemotherapy or mastectomy might have been. And it matters because, you know, Macpherson was diagnosed early, it sounds like, and given options that were more or less interventionist because they offered similar outcomes, and she opted for the less interventionist outcomes. Not surprising for a woman
still,
who,
incidentally, as it turns out, involved holing herself away in a property for 7 or 8 months in Phoenix, Arizona with medical care. So, I mean, it's not as if she did nothing.
That's true. She had a holistic dentist on hand, for goodness sake. You know, she had the best and weirdest kinds of treatment available to her. And, you know, lots of doctors do agree that offering various kinds of different options helps tailor treatments to patients' personal preferences and concerns. And for someone who, I was just about to say, like, has made her entire life on her body, it's not surprising that she might have been keen on options that weren't going to change her body. I think it is important to not just see this as a kind of, you know, celebrity takes weird approach to a thing that should be treated with a very particular path, although most doctors do line up and say it's radiation, chemotherapy and surgery that solve cancer. So we shouldn't be fooled about that.
I mean, Sorcha, do you blame journalists as well for not contextualising and critiquing Elle's story better in the first place? Or do you blame, as some critics do, Elle Macpherson for talking about her cancer treatment at all? It's sort of not her fault that so many people are interested in it, is it? It is what happened to her, and it's how she wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, because I think, you know, obviously Elle Macpherson can do what she likes with her body and is completely entitled to seek whatever treatment she wishes to seek, although, you know, we as journalists would probably say, well, hopefully we would say that probably isn't the most effective treatment. I think that has been the initial problem, because as journalists we are supposed to provide context and report on the facts of the situation, and although you of course should report on what a person of interest is saying, I think it's crucial that you provide that context and additional facts and information about what has been proven scientifically to be the correct treatment. That is, you know, our entire role as journalists. And I do think, you know, this Guardian article was absolutely fantastic and a fantastic piece of journalism, because it was a corrective to, I think, perhaps journalism that was not up to standard in the initial story. Also, I think it's interesting to think about, although she is entitled, as you know, as person in the spotlight, to talk about what she wants to talk about, so also she needs to think about influence and how much influence she has over people as, you know, someone who is highly regarded for whatever reason, and think about how that can inform people's health decisions. And, you know, that is the danger here, if you kind of give a person platform to say what they like without contextualizing and without providing additional information on top of that.
Yes, and you could say, Suchandrika, that, as I was hinting there, it's her experience and why can't she tell it? Perhaps with more persuasiveness, if it weren't for the fact that I looked at the Women's Weekly article, it links straight through to her alternative wellness brand. And so the thing that she's plugging alongside her book is lotions and potions and vitamins and stuff, which by themselves I'm sure aren't bad for you. But there's an implication, isn't there? It's not said explicitly, but there is an implication. Look, I'm still beautiful. Look, I cured myself. And by the way, for $60 a month, you can buy my green algae and put it in your milkshake. And you worry that people would think, oh, well, that's the solution, and frankly get ripped off.
How much is the discount of the green algae? Just checking. It's for a friend. Yeah, it's her goop, isn't it? It's being sold on a cancer diagnosis, which is absolutely horrifying. And when you do go back and look at this article in the magazine, it's true that, like, Elle Macpherson can say what she wants, but she's been published and she's been interviewed by a magazine, and so those editors with the book and the journalist and the editor at the magazine, they should be looking at what can we add in, or how can we frame this so that we are talking about something serious here. We're talking about other options for treatment, and we're not just building an advertorial for her company that is angled on her illness, but this is actually being used as a medical story, and it's actually fuel for kind of the anti-Western medicine, anti-vaxxer type people, one of whom she used to date. And we have to get into this. My most least favourite ex-couple of all time, Elle Macpherson, the body, and Andrew Wakefield, who, for people who don't remember, just had a quick check of his Wikipedia, and it literally calls him a British fraudster, discredited academic, anti-vaccine activist, and former physician.
So he was the guy who was struck off the medical register for saying there was a link between the MMR vaccine and autism, wasn't he?
Because the research involved 12 children. And along with Margaret Thatcher's name, this name was taken in vain in my household quite a lot in the late 80s and early 90s, my dad being a doctor. So he did exactly the same thing back in the day. He had a quote-unquote peer-reviewed piece. It wasn't good enough. It wasn't up to standard, but it was amplified so much because people wanted to find a reason behind why their children were being diagnosed with autism. And it just so happens that the symptoms of autism appear when a child is around 3, which just by chance is when they tend to have the MMR, and they're not related. But people still now, that next generation of children who are just a bit younger than me, they didn't get them vaccinated. And so we've now got the NHS vaccinating people up to the age of 25 who missed out as a child, because we have the worst outbreak of measles this century. And measles can still kill.
There's another case that it reminds me of as well, Arion, and that is another Australian case, which is that of Belle Gibson, the Instagram scammer, who, for listeners who don't remember, there's a fabulous 2-part ITV documentary about this, sort of went all over the internet saying, I had a terrible terminal cancer and cured myself through juices, and was published by Penguin Random House and interviewed by Australian Women's Weekly until they worked out she was a fraudster. And I was just astonished to see after that experience that this book by Elle Macpherson is being published by Penguin Random House and has a big puff piece by Australian Women's Weekly. It's like they haven't learnt anything. And it's not to say that Elle Macpherson can't talk about her experience. It's that why doesn't it just have the basic warning label on it that experience might have taught them of these experiences are unusual. Here's a link through to a cancer society to tell you so.
I think that's a really important point. And I think, while we may be willing to be sympathetic to an individual celebrity or influencer who has a position that we don't agree with, but that's their own position and we understand that that's what they think, I think there is an important thing here that celebrities and more recently influencers do have a profound effect on the public and its perception of illness, as well as their propensity to engage with screening or treatment. So, some go in the face of evidence. Think of Gwyneth Paltrow and her jade inserts for vaginas, or Madonna drinking urine, and Kardashians with their various fatty weight loss treatments. Others are framed more positively, like Kylie Minogue taking like a really sort of public stance about her own breast cancer treatment, or Angelina Jolie doing the same when she faced the risk of ovarian cancer. But even those sorts of seemingly reasonable feel-good stories about life-saving screening can result in either overdiagnosis or overtreatment, and it also raises questions about whether we should better try to harness the power of celebrities for improved health outcomes. So I think you're right. If you're Penguin or if you're Australian Women's Weekly, you have to think intensely carefully before you go ahead and publish these medical-related stories, especially if they have alternative claims that are not medically accepted. I think that there is a great responsibility in the case of media to be a sensible gatekeeper with this. And I think that is where possibly the main failure occurs in this particular story.
I mean, do you think that really is a present danger, Sorcha, that normal people, quote unquote, do seek the advice, the endorsement of celebrities above and equal to doctors?
I think perhaps the issue at play is, although it's easy to just say, oh, well, the prevalence of this problem of people turning to alternative medicine is because of misinformation. I think there is an underlying serious issue that perhaps there are a lot of people who don't feel particularly listened to by doctors or by the medical profession, who have lost trust in the medical profession, and therefore they are seeking people that they do trust or feel that they can trust, which is why it is, I think, quite dangerous when sort of celebrities promote these alternative medicines, because they're not effective, but it is preying on people's very genuine fears and worries about not being listened to or trusted. And I think particularly in the UK, perhaps the NHS is very good at emergencies. If you're in immediate danger, I think most people would say yes, we're really good at that in the UK. But sort of long-term pain, discomfort, long-term chronic issues, we're not very good at dealing with those things. And so yes, people do look for alternative sources of information in the wrong places, I think.
Suchandrika.
So I read something written by Filippo Anelli, who's the president of Italy's National Federation of Orders of Surgeons and Dentists. And basically, in Italy, in their constitution, they have a citizens' right to health or respecting their freedom to choose what is best for them. So Dr. Anelli is involved in a project where in the digital age, that trust relationship between doctors and patients has kind of been eroded, and he's working on trying to make that better. He said we're experiencing a monumental shift from paternalism to a partnership between doctors and patients. And in this new society of rights, doctors must play a vital role in ensuring a democracy of good where the well-being of citizens is paramount. And a couple of ways he thinks this could change is courses in medical schools that extend to the internet and social media and how to improve doctor-patient communication while taking those things into account, and also shielding the public from fake news. So that's quite a big thing to suggest, that doctors and medics should be involved in this huge battle we have against fake news, which, as all of us as journalists know, is very difficult to deal with and kind of comes from all sides. But he feels doctors should be involved in that because it's important information that can change people's lives and possibly save them. And he says that, sometimes the best quote unquote treatment from a scientific standpoint is not the best for a specific patient. And in such cases, a doctor should propose alternatives, which it sounds like Professor Chris Pike, who commented on Elle Macpherson's condition but didn't treat her, said that there are different kinds of options from radiation to chemo and all these kinds of things. It depends on the condition.
That lumpectomy by itself might have been suitable for her condition anyway.
So exactly that. So it's about communicating that, and when the patient is reporting on their condition, which Elle Macpherson was probably right to do in many ways, she brings a spotlight to it. It's about making sure that the journalist is maybe speaking to doctors who are well versed in dealing with journalists and saying a line at the bottom that there are other options here. Here is a link to a cancer research website, but something official, because all we hear in that particular piece from Australian Women's Weekly is Elle Macpherson's voice, and unfortunately she's not a medical expert, and it's led to a lot of very unhappy people and possibly some people who have stopped believing in their treatment, which is really worrying.
Okay. Double O cetacean. That's right. Spy whales after this. Arion, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A whale who came from Russia with love has now lived and let died.
Over the past 5 years, he'd become a popular visitor to the Scandinavian coastline. But his desire to interact with humans brought its own dangers. The non-profit One Whale was formed to advocate for better protections.
We have watched him get hit by propellers, his body sliced open by sharp objects, injuries from tourists putting sharp things in his mouth.
Whale charity activists talking to ABC News Australia on Monday. Arion, who were they talking about?
They were talking about Valdemir the whale, which is a pun on the Norwegian word for whale, which is Val, and the first name of the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. And the story is that this week, this much-loved whale that rose from fame in Norway for possibly having been trained by Russia as a spy, died in unexpected circumstances.
Okay, let's unpick that sentence for a second. This much-loved whale, just explain that first of all. How did he rise to fame?
Yeah, right. So Valdemir first appeared off the coast in Norway's far northern Finnmark region in 2019. And when he was found, Norwegian marine biologists quickly removed a man-made harness that had this mount on it that would have potentially fit an action camera, sort of GoPro type thing. And they found the words Equipment St. Petersburg printed curiously in English. That's a weird detail on the plastic clasps. And people thought that meant that this was some kind of a Russian-trained spy whale, but on the other hand, a chap called Morten Vikeby, who was a former Norwegian consul, suggested that rather than being a spy, this might have been a therapy whale, given his similarity to another whale that he had met in Russia that was sometimes used to entertain tour groups of children with mental disabilities. Either way, Valdemir subsequently gained local fame, particularly because he was incredibly friendly and he'd interact with people and, once retrieved a phone that a woman had accidentally dropped into the water, and he'd also playfully steal and retrieve things from people. So he became this absolute celebrity.
Okay, and then on the spy whale thing that you just brush off like that's a normal phrase. Suchandrika, talk us through the history of, as you understand it, of animals and espionage.
I mean, as I understand it, this is real stuff here. By the way, I love that this spy whale is like retrieving phones and like, what? A spy whale? Anyway, okay, so we've got some amazing animals that have been trained as spies. So, number one, obviously pigeons. It's the first one you think of, the pigeons. The CIA.
The homing pigeon, right.
Yeah. They had an extensive pigeon spy program during the Cold War. They had Operation Tucana in the 70s, which was where pigeons went into the Soviet Union, and they were very successful in gathering information about Soviet facilities and also finding chips. And also the British Intelligence Committee had a pigeon subcommittee, which I love beyond life, but they didn't carry out any operations that we know of, didn't they? Okay, then we have cats. Did you know cats can be great spies? That makes sense, right? So in the 60s, guess what? The CIA, again, they developed an operation to use cats as listening devices, and actually that one's still ongoing.
Hold on. How does a cat communicate what it's learned?
Well,
it's got a speaker in its collar, has it?
Much more than that. So first of all, the project is called Operation Acoustic Kitty, which is a band name. I love that. And involves implanting a microphone in the cat's ear and then a radio transmitter at the base of its skull, and then winding an antenna through to the tail. So cats are really giving up a lot of their lives for this. They estimate that all the surgical and training expenses of this project cost the CIA $20 million. So you've got dolphins. Obviously, dolphins are a big one. So the Soviet Union has trained dolphins to search for underwater mines around naval bases.
Right, okay, well, that makes sense, sort of. I mean, that's like a sniffer dog, isn't it, but in the sea?
Yeah, and more adorable. And they protected the entrance to the Soviet Black Sea Fleet off the coast of Sevastopol in Crimea. And if a diver gets close to the entrance, the dolphins will signal to a coastal station using echolocations. That's pretty good.
Okay. I mean, obviously, we could all listen to this all day, but what justification is there for a beluga whale spy? Like, what could a beluga whale do?
Yeah, they offer the same advantages as dolphins. Basically, they have echolocation or sonar that they can use to detect things. They're very fast and nimble. They also don't suffer from the bends like humans do, so they're much quicker than humans underwater, and they can be trained. They're very intelligent, and so they have the potential, and this is why people still don't know whether Valdemir was a spy or not, but they have the same potential as dolphins to be used in this sort of programs. And crucially, Russia has never given any response to these accusations that it trained up this whale and then it somehow got away. So that has definitely fanned the flames of what this animal actually was.
Sorcha, in your view, was Vladimir, I can't even say it, a spy?
I mean, it's certainly possible. You know, just to add to what Arion was saying, the US has actually had since the 1960s, and which is still ongoing, a Navy Marine mammal program, which does train dolphins for things like mine detection and underwater surveillance. And, you know, it has been, you know, widely speculated that Russia has similar programs. So it's definitely not something outside of the realms of possibility. This is definitely something that has been tried many, many times.
Well, I mean, someone put the harness on him, right? I mean, they're not born with harnesses on.
Oh, well, yeah. And actually, I think there was a big news story in Russia a few months ago that essentially sort of a whale farm was discovered in the far east of Russia, where around 80 or 90 beluga whales and some dolphins were actually being held in captivity. And it was thought that they were then either sold on to sort of ocean world in Russia for either, you know, doing tricks and entertainment, or also maybe perhaps for research purposes as well.
Do you find anything in the reports of his death that makes you suspicious one way or the other?
I mean, the fact that he was shot could sort of point to anything, but definitely he's sort of gained a lot of traction and attention over the last few years. And I think if Russia does have this problem with sort of these whale prisons, and, you know, these whales have essentially been escaping from these whale prisons, perhaps they don't really want to, they don't want loose whales swimming around. Yeah.
What's your theory, Arion? I mean, Sorcha says, you know, him being shot could be anything, but I mean, beluga whales aren't in the habit of being shot in Scandinavia, so...
Yeah. Well, we should add to that whole suggestion that he was shot came from a woman called Regina.
Wasn't Elle Macpherson, was
it? No, then we should take it very seriously. And Haug is the head of One Whale, which was this charity that was set up actually to specifically protect Valdemir. So unfortunately that didn't go very well. But she said that she'd viewed Valdemir's body on Monday, and she told the AFP press agency that he had multiple bullet wounds around his body, And then the director of NOAA, which was another charity, Siri Martinson, said the injuries on the whale are alarming and of a nature that cannot be ruled out as a criminal act. It's shocking. And a marine biologist, Sebastian Strand, said it's absolutely horrible. He was apparently in good condition as of Friday, so we have to figure out what happened here. And there's certainly something mysterious about his death, because he died at about the age of somewhere between 15 and 20, and typically beluga whales can live between sort of 40 to 60 years.
But he was hanging around humans a lot, right? I mean, that's why he was all over the internet. That's why people know who he was. So, I mean, there's just the risk, isn't there, to being close to humans all the time?
Absolutely, and he was getting lots of scratches because he was coming up against boats and foreign objects were being put in his mouth in this sort of playful way, not a sinister way necessarily, but we really do have to say that Valdemir's body has been transported to the local branch of the Norwegian Veterinary Institute for an autopsy, and the report isn't actually expected back for another 3 weeks. So we do have this long period where the mystery, and admittedly there is this sort of suspicion that hangs over it, but the mystery is going to linger for longer, and we don't know whether these marks that were seen on him by activists were bullet wounds or they were something else, and we're going to have to wait for that one.
Okay, but regardless, Suchandrika, of whether this whale was a spy and whether he was even from Russia, just because he was wearing a harness that said St. Petersburg on it, the point is his life and death and his connection to humans does have that advantage that actually we were discussing in the last story with Elle Macpherson in a way, which is that he's a public face of being a beluga whale, right? People had personal contact with this whale, put him all over the internet, and that brings the problems of marine life to humans all over the world looking on their social media feeds, and that's probably a good thing for awareness.
Yeah, I mean, you hope so, don't you? I think there is such a history of animal news where people kind of put human characteristics onto animals, as we're very much doing with this spy whale. People can kind of understand a gigantic problem like the seas warming and rising, like global warming, a bit more easily and a bit more digestibly if it's through the eyes of a whale or through the eyes of an animal that we can anthropomorphize and try and feel how it's feeling, try and understand what's going on because we identify with the animal. So in that sense, maybe Valdemir's legacy will be that we learn something about Russia or about the ocean or about Norway that we can try and put right or figure out or help, or about, was he in an environment that he could survive in, because he was very far north. He was too far north for his species, so maybe we'll learn something that we can help others of his species, hopefully.
A very erudite answer, which I happen to know you delivered the entire way through with a massive whale mask next to you. Can you now show us the whale mask? I told you not to do this before now.
What?
It looks more like a shark.
It's a whale. It's a
pointiest teeth in a whale I've ever seen.
Do whales have...
You're clearly
it's a great white.
It's
you
a
are
shark.
obviously a great
That's
white.
a great white. Okay, so
It was sold to me as a whale.
This for this? Why have you?
You've been conned.
Yeah, you've fallen
I've been scammed. Elle Macpherson said it was a whale. I've been told this suits me, which I don't know how to take. Yeah, it's for my show. It's for doom scrolling, my little comedy show. It's about the news and the speed of it, and I'm trying to explain it to my niece who's 5. And there is just so much news about whales that I use it as a way to look at climate change, which I know nobody likes to talk about in journalism or comedy, so I'll say no more.
Right, so you dress up as a shark and have your entire audience thinking the whole way through, why is she saying she's a whale?
Absolutely
That's misinformation personified, isn't it?
It was from Amazon. It was £15 and it's now a tax write-off. And it's a whale.
My thanks to Arion, Suchandrika and Sorcha. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and then tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription when you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio, and until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.
It's a whale.
There's no way that's a whale.
That's not a whale.
100% a shark.